the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable, now being seen in 120 communities throughout the United States of America. And we're pleased to have as our guest for this broadcast someone who back in the 1980s had an association with the Conservative Caucus and now holds a position of great responsibility with a very important Washington think tank, the Cato Institute. Jerry Taylor is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and is one of America's leading experts on energy policy and on environmental issues as well. You know, isn't it interesting that conservatives get a bad rap when it comes to the environment, when it comes to energy, when in fact we should be the heroes of the moment? Because what can be better for the environment than respect for private property? And what can be better for energy than the pro-development policies that conservatives espouse?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's interesting. If you go back through Al Gore's book, Earth and the Balance, you'll find lots of rhetoric in there, not generally forgotten today, about how capitalism is a prerequisite for environmental protection, about how property rights is crucial for the environment. And if you want to see what lack of property rights does for the environment, go to the old Soviet Union and see the horrible devastation there. So even someone like Al Gore, who's somebody I generally don't agree with on very many things, even acknowledges all those points, but they're often forgotten by the modern environmental movement. And as far as energy is concerned, well, as we're talking today, the Republicans seem to have the initiative on the energy conversation by talking about the need to get more domestic production into the pipeline, to drill in Alaska, to drill offshore. And the public is rallying to their side, and it looks like there might be a change coming.
Jerry, Boone Pickens says that 70% of our oil comes from abroad, comes from foreign countries. Is he right?
Well, it's not quite 70%, but it's getting close. He's right, but it really doesn't matter. Let's assume all the oil came from Texas and Oklahoma. If there was a supply disruption in the Middle East, it would increase the price of crude everywhere, no matter where it's produced, because oil is a global fungible economic commodity. So even if we were energy independent, we could not immunize ourselves against supply disruptions abroad. And you can see that just by looking at the current situation with Iran. We don't import any crude oil from Iran. But if Iran quit producing oil for the global market, prices will go up in the United States immediately, just as if we were getting it. So I don't think that...
Why is that?
Well, the main reason is oil will go to wherever people are willing to pay the most money for it. And it's a low-cost transport. It doesn't cost a lot of money to move it around the world. So there is a global price for crude oil, and everyone pays it. And so it really doesn't matter where the oil comes from. It's available on the world market if you're willing to pay the market-clearing price. And I think energy independence is sort of like an argument that would have you believe in food independence, steel independence, car independence. It's protectionism under a different name, and it's bad for consumers.
If we wanted to derive all of our oil domestically, would that be possible?
No, I don't believe it would be. Not under reasonable prices, anyway. Today we use about 20 million barrels a day of oil. We produce only about 5 million barrels a day. So we could cut back 15 out of 20 million barrels a day of crude oil consumption, or we could find another source of supply, and there really are no reasonable ones at current prices that we could use.
Where is the oil within the continental United States? We know about Alaska. Is there a great deal of oil in particular states of our union?
Well, the place where we're going to find the most oil is in the Rocky Mountain West. It's locked up in shale rock, and the amount of crude oil thought to be locked up in that rock is triple the amount of proved reserves of Saudi Arabia. Now, why don't we exploit that oil? Well, two reasons. One, it's on federal lands, and it's off limits to the industry. That's one reason.
But that could be changed.
That could be changed. But the most important reason is the second reason. It's really expensive to get oil out of shale rock. The most recent study I've seen that I think is credible on this comes from the Rand Corporation. They estimate that world crude oil prices would have to average around $95 a barrel over the entire lifetime of investment before you can make a profit getting oil out of shale. Now, of course, right now, price for oil is about $140 a barrel. It's probably economic if these prices were to continue over the long haul.
The Canadians seem to be focusing more and more on shale.
They do. They've got a tremendous, well, actually not quite shale, it's tar sands in Alberta. That's a tremendous source of oil for Canada. It is causing it's leading to a great increase in production there. And it's all going to the United States. There's a lot of shale, a lot of tar sands around the world. that are economic when prices are high. When prices are low, nobody was touching that stuff.
Now, Brazil is drilling for oil off our east coast. If we were to drill for oil there, how would that ameliorate our situation?
Not much. I mean, we don't, first of all, it's important to note that we have really no idea how much crude oil might be available in the Gulf of Mexico or off California, because we haven't really explored those areas very thoroughly. But let's assume if we were optimistic, we might say, well, maybe those areas which are currently off limits could maybe produce about 1.5 million barrels a day of the world crude oil market when the fields are mature. Well, by that time, we'll probably be looking at something close to 100 million barrels of global oil production a day. That means we'd be increasing world supply by 1.5%. Over the long haul, that means about a 1.5% decline in prices. So that's not to say we shouldn't drill, but I think a lot of people are under the belief that if we would just drill in Alaska, if we could just drill in the Gulf of Mexico, we could largely become energy independent, we could drop oil prices tomorrow by a significant amount. And that's really not really going to happen.
Well, we know in West Africa there's a great deal of oil. Angola, Nigeria, other places. And communist China is spending a great deal of time and money building connections with the various regimes of Africa. Are we being locked out of that?
I don't think it's really something we ought to worry about. What China's trying to do is lock up stable sources of supply through long-term contractual arrangement. The theory the Chinese seem to have is they get a better deal through a long-term contract with a producer than they'd get in the world crude oil market. Maybe they do, but so far they haven't. The U.S. and other Western European powers pursued that policy too in the 1950s and 1960s. Didn't get them very far. What usually happens in the oil market is when producers realize that their contractual partner is getting a good deal at their expense, the contract is ripped up and renegotiated, or assets are nationalized or something else. So all it means is that China is getting its supply from source A rather than source B, C, or D. It doesn't really matter to American consumers one way or the other, I don't think.
Why is gas costing $4 a gallon at the pump?
Well, there are a lot of different things that go into that, but I think the fundamental story is global economic expansion. High oil prices are a manifestation of good global economic news. The boom in this decade.
So there's much greater demand for oil,
absolutely.
And that has pushed the price up.
China's a good example of this. When people talk about the surge in demand in China, what they're usually thinking is a lot of Chinese used to ride bicycles are now driving cars, and this is the main reason for the surge. That's not really quite true. A lot of Chinese are driving cars, but the main reason for the surge in demand for oil in China is because their manufacturing facilities can't rely on electricity in China because the grid's in terrible shape, lots of blackouts and brownouts. So if you're a Chinese manufacturer, you need to have on-site generating capacity, which means diesel-powered generators, which use crude oil. So it's the booming manufacturing base in China that's really driving the
when one goes to the gas station, the price of diesel is higher than the price of regular gas. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, the main reason is that Europe has moved largely from gasoline to diesel because of regulations adopted about 10 years ago on that continent. And what it's meant is that diesel supplies are awful tight. Gasoline supplies are relatively abundant compared to diesel because there's much more diesel consumption in Europe than there is in the United States. And that global demand for diesel is driving up diesel prices in the U.S. And the relative glut in gasoline, if you can call it a glut when you're paying $4 a gallon, it's still less than you're paying for diesel. That benefits American drivers.
The dollar is not what it used to be. It's in steady decline against the euro and other currencies. And to a very great degree, the weakness of the dollar is at least indirectly related to the profligacy of the U.S. government, our huge indebtedness, the fact that much of our debt is owned by foreign governments. To what degree is the weak dollar responsible for the high price of gas at the pump?
It's a substantial contributor. Not only does it increase the price of crude oil somewhat directly, but also indirectly in that European customers, because their euros are worth so much more than the dollar, well, since the global oil trade is conducted in dollars, to buy oil, the Europeans have to convert their euro into a dollar. You can buy a lot more dollars with the euro today than you could have 5 or 6 years ago. So they're not getting the price signals that American consumers are getting because of the strength of their currency, which means they're not conserving as much as they might otherwise had the dollar been stronger.
Now, it seems to me to be idiotic to suggest that a solution to the crisis is to raise gas taxes, but there are some liberals proposing that. At the state level, are there many states reducing gas taxes?
Some are. Some states have looked at that. Indiana's one. There are several others. And I think that's probably a positive step in the long run. But what's also a problematic at the state level is that you've got laws which have mandatory markup standards. In other words, let's assume you're a gasoline station. You want to sell at cost because you want people to come into your service store and buy cigarettes or something else which you can make more of a profit on. Well, you go to jail. You have a mandatory markup law in over 20 states in the union, and you have a number of states which keep places like Walmart, Costco, Sam's Club from selling gasoline at all because they want to keep business with the mom and pops, and that generally means higher prices.
We're going to have to go to a break, but my wife and I travel around the Commonwealth of Virginia with some frequency, and it's hard for us to understand why in Vienna, Virginia, gas can be $4.25, and Culpeper, Virginia, it can be $3.85. Why?
Environmental regulations. There are tighter environmental regulations in areas which are violating federal air quality standards, which means that service stations have to sell a environmentally friendly gasoline blend, which is more expensive to produce, costs more, and when you're in Culpeper, you're out of the non-attainment area for federal air quality standards. The gasoline's cheaper because it doesn't need to have that kind of special blending agent that is required.
Very interesting. We're going to have to take a break. Stick with us, and we'll be back with more that you need to know about energy policy from Jerry Taylor, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. We'll be right back. There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, and our guest is Jerry Taylor, Senior Fellow with the Cato Institute and one of America's leading experts on energy and environmental policies, if not the leading expert. He's the author or co-author of numerous policy studies on federal energy policy and sustainable development, and has contributed to several anthologies, including the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, Energy, and American Society, 13 Myths, Market Liberalism, A New Paradigm for the 21st Centuries, the Cato Handbook for Congress, China as a Global Economic Power, Market Reforms in the New Millennium, and Earth Report 2000, Revisiting the True State of the Planet. Well, let's talk about all of the attacks that have been directed at the energy companies. What do you make of them? Who is generating these attacks? Is it just traditional socialism, the traditional politics of envy and greed, or is there something else?
Well, I mean, Frederick Bastiat noted back in France centuries ago that when bread prices went up, the mob's first reaction was to burn the bakeries, which was entirely counterproductive. When gasoline and oil prices go up, the mob's first instinct is to burn down the oil companies, the guys who were supplying the oil and the gasoline. There is a conspiracist mindset in the American public. I think liberals and conservatives hold it, which is that oil companies have great monopoly power. The prices are established by whim. They price high when they feel greedy. They price low when they feel scared of democratic administrations or something to that effect. It's all silliness. It's as incoherent as any oddball conspiracy theory you might see coming down the block, but that's the way most of the American public thinks about oil companies.
What is going on in Congress? What has Congress been attempting to do with respect to big oil as it's called, and I'm glad to see that they've lost some of their big battles in Congress.
Well,
The left is lost.
The Democrats are trying to get rid of price gouging. I'm not even sure what that means, because price gouging is perfectly legal. In fact, all that means is pricing at the intersection of supply and demand. But apparently, you're supposed to price at cost. Now, for a lot of people, that sounds good, but have you ever tried to do that when you were selling your house? Did you go back and say, well, I paid X for the house, I should only mark it up by 10%, that's what I'm going to sell it? No, you sell it at cost. You sell things what the market will bear. Now, in the oil company's case, 90% of the oil, say, that ExxonMobil is selling to you at their service stations, they didn't produce in their fields. They bought on the spot market. They paid market prices. They bought the oil to make that gasoline at $140 a barrel. They don't have the power to just arbitrarily sell it at $2 to be nice to you. If they did, they'd take a terrible beating. So the Democrats are largely shaking their fists at oil company profits. They're shaking their fists at speculators, who they also believe are at the root of this.
Now, what is a speculator?
Well, it depends on who you ask. There are strict economic definitions, but most of us, when we think of speculators, we think about people who are making bets about future prices. So the idea that speculators could affect wholesale spot prices, the actual price in the here and now, is essentially to say people who bet about future prices can affect present prices, just as people who bet on who's going to win the Super Bowl can affect who wins the Super Bowl. Now, it's theoretically possible that the bets about future price can affect present price, but the only way they have any intellectual coherence is if they affect market behavior in the here and now. Like if the futures price gets too high, then people have an incentive to take oil off the market, put it into inventory, so they can sell forward in the futures market and make a guaranteed profit. So in other words, if speculation is driving current price, the bit of evidence we would expect to see is inventory buildup, because otherwise it couldn't have an effect on supply or demand. Question, do we see inventory buildup today? No, in fact, we're seeing inventories liquidate. They're not being built up, they're being reduced. And in fact, the market in the oil futures market is backwardated, which means the prices 5 years from now, after you take account for interest rates and holding costs, are lower than prices today. So this is essentially like arguing that bets on who's going to win the Super Bowl are going to affect who wins the Super Bowl. It's theoretically possible, but I need a narrative to explain how that's going to work.
Only if it's fixed.
Only if it's somebody may throw a football game because the bets are out there and the money's being made in Vegas, right? So in other words, the narratives are there, but I need to hear a storyline about it. Most of the people who are telling this story don't provide any narrative whatsoever.
Well, let's talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. How much is in it?
About 700 million barrels of oil are in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and that's quite a bit.
If we're totally depleted, how long would it last?
Well,
how long would that supply last?
Only a matter of months. It wouldn't last a year, depending on how quickly we release. We could release 4.3 million barrels a day, which is the equivalent of adding an Iran and a Kuwait to the world crude oil market. And that's one of the good things I think the Democrats are saying these days, which I agree with, is that we ought to release the reserve. We ought to tap it and release it full bore. The SPR is a federal hoarding operation that does consumers no good and provides no good security benefit. It's time to put the oil to work.
Are you not concerned that the time may come when we're blocked from receiving foreign oil and when our domestic drilling has been limited and we might need the oil in the Strategic Reserve?
No. You can have all the oil you want if you're willing to pay market prices for crude oil. There's only two ways that we would have a problem getting a hold of actual physical inventories of oil. Possibility one, every single planet on the globe, save for the United States, or excuse me, every single country on the globe refuses to trade with the United States. Because after all, when Saudi Arabia produces oil, it goes to wherever markets dictate it goes. In 1973, for instance, during the embargo, instead of buying oil from Arab members of OPEC, we simply bought oil from people who bought oil from Arab members of OPEC. So as long as someone's doing oil business with us, we don't have to worry about embargoes. The second, of course, possibility is that somebody with a deep-sea naval fleet were able to put a blockade on all U.S. ports. Now, I don't see that happening in the near term either. So absent those two things, the SPR does us no favors. It's trying to ensure that we have physical access to oil when, in fact, as long as we're willing to pay market prices, we can have all the oil we want 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Talk to me about Hugo Chavez. Is it true that he benefits whenever you fill your tank at a Citgo station?
Well, he benefits whenever you fill your tank anywhere, because the profits that Hugo Chavez makes in the oil business are dictated by global supply and demand curves. In other words, if we didn't buy from Citgo, if the United States bought no Venezuelan crude whatsoever, if we froze his crude oil out of the U.S. market, he would simply sell it somewhere else. We would have to go somewhere else to get the crude oil, and we'd just have a game of musical chairs regarding who sells to whom. Now, he would have to charge a little more because of the transportation cost, but not a great deal more. So the idea that you're striking a blow against Chavez by not buying at Citgo, I think, is wrong. Chavez doesn't care where you buy it.
Now let's talk about Joseph Kennedy and the deal that he made with Chavez, as he did previously with the communist government in Angola, to supposedly take advantage of the generosity of the Angolan communists and the Venezuelan despot to help the poor people of the United States. Tell us about that.
Well, what Hugo Chavez did was make an arrangement with Joe Kennedy, which allowed Joe Kennedy to distribute a very low-cost Venezuelan crude oil to low-income households in the United States via Joe Kennedy's operation. This was an attempt.
And Joe Kennedy made a substantial personal profit from that operation.
I'm not sure what his profits were. It's a non-profit organization.
He was pulling in about $600,000 a year.
The Kennedys managed to do very well for themselves. The problem I have with this arrangement is that Venezuelan crude is blood crude, and the money is blood money. I mean, that money is accumulated by Hugo Chavez by exploiting the Venezuelan people, running down that economy, and it's in my opinion, it's dirty money.
Well, there's a lot of dirty money out there. For years, I've been encouraging people to boycott Chevron because by virtue of their close relationship with Republican administrations, having people like George Shultz and Condi Rice on their board, they were propping up the communist government in Angola, even to the point of having Cuban troops defend the Chevron drilling operations in Cabinda province of Angola. So I've got a soft spot in my heart for those who would do Chevron in, but they're still doing it. Well, Jerry, we have about a minute left. What closing words would you have for the people watching the program?
Well, I think most Americans are waiting for the government to put together an energy plan to get us out of this mess, and I think that's just wrong. We don't have a national car plan, a national computer plan, a national sporting goods plan. We don't need an energy plan. Energy is no different than any other commodity in the marketplace. When prices are high, it induces conservation, it induces investments in new supply. The idea that the market would work better if politicians decided what power plants we built, where we drilled for oil, what we drilled, how much we consumed, when we consumed it. The idea that central planning will work in energy markets, though it's never worked in any other sector of the economy, is awful thin.
Didn't work for Stalin, didn't work for Khrushchev, and it wouldn't work for us.
Right.
Well, Jerry, we're going to have to take another break. When we come back, you'll have a couple of minutes to offer some parting words for our viewers and to tell them how they can plug in to your network of information at Cato. Stay with us, and we will return very shortly after these public service messages with Jerry Taylor.
I'm Congressman Tom Tancredo. You know, I just returned from a hearing on the southern border in a place called Brownsville, Texas. One of the participants in the hearing told us that for them, a border really doesn't exist between the United States and Mexico. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people have that attitude, that there are no such things as borders, that they really don't matter, that they're just lines on a map and nobody should pay attention to them, and that we're all just residents of the North American continent. Well, you know what? That's baloney. It's baloney, but only if you will do something about it to prove to the people of this country, and especially to your elected officials, that you know borders matter, that you know the sovereignty of this country is at risk, and that you will take action to make sure that they understand it. That action is best taken by calling your local talk radio stations, writing letters to the editor, and of course, letting members of Congress know that you know. That's the best thing. They're hoping, as a matter of fact, that no one really picks up on this issue of a North American trade association that essentially eliminates borders. But the fact is it's happening. You can see parts of it all of the time. So it's something that we need to stop. America, and I mean the United States of America, not the continent, but the United States of America is at stake. Do your part.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable, now being seen in more than 120 communities throughout the United States. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Conservative Roundtable, I hope you will check out our website, conservativeusa.org. If you want to receive some of our literature, please fax us your contact information at 703-281-4108. Jerry, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, the best way is to go to the Cato Institute website, www.cato.org, and click on Experts and click on my name, and you'll see all the electronic versions of the material I've written and contact information and everything your heart could desire.
If people wanted to acquire even a scintilla or a fraction of the information that you've developed and the knowledge you have, what particular things ought they ask for?
Well, the energy issues are quite broad. A lot of people worry about energy and national security, and the worry that our money is going abroad to terrorism and propping up bad regimes. And that's one of the main reasons people think we need to have an energy policy. And I actually wrote an article recently for the Georgetown Law Review, which is available also as a version of an essay that's on our website for a foreign policy magazine called Limes, which is an Italian magazine, and there's a essay by me on that topic, which I would recommend. I think it's very good.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Conservative Roundtable. And Jerry Taylor, we're grateful for the wonderful work that you do, and we appreciate you having taken the time to be with us for this broadcast. And you've contributed significantly to the education of the people who are wise enough to watch this program.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. We'll see you on the next edition of Conservative Roundtable.